Hey guys, it's Dr. May. How are you today? So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to be summarizing what they call basic concepts and skills in sensorimotor psychotherapy. So this is basically an overview of what I've already presented in videos 4 through 12, and it corresponds to chapters 4 through 12 in the sensorimotor psychotherapy textbook. So I like to do this because it kind of consolidates the information in your mind. So if you already watched the videos, it kind of like puts it all together in one spot to keep it fresh. And if you haven't watched them already, it'll give you a taste of what those videos covered. So you can decide, which ones you would like to watch, which might be most beneficial to you. All right, so that'll be the goal of today. And I'll get this up for us here. All right, here we go. So overview of sensorimotor psychotherapy, basic concepts and skills. Okay, so someone took this picture hovering above a coastline. So just like that, we're going to be hovering above and looking at the broad picture of the first section of sensorimotor psychotherapy. So this lays the foundation for a lot of the other stuff to come. But in and of themselves, they're really actually very useful and very interesting. So we'll give you a little flavor of that today. All right, so the first chapter we covered was called The Wisdom of the Body, Lost and Found. So as we talked about, sensorimotor psychotherapy has to do a lot with our body, that we're going to try to change the quality of our life and help resolve trauma and attachment issues by working with our body. So our bodies have a lot of wisdom. They're meant to help us adapt to difficult circumstances or positive circumstances. And our patterns of movement and our patterns of posture and sensation are all geared to help us adapt to whatever situation we're in. So understanding our body better is the first step toward making some physical changes that'll then help us to resolve our issues. So sometimes when it's triggering to pay attention to our body because it's linked to stuff from the past, we cut off from our body. But we're going to try to encourage everybody to work past some of our fears and to kind of reconnect with our body so we could use it as a resource. So it might have been lost because we disconnected from it, but we're hopefully going to find the wisdom of it again and really use it to our own benefit now. Okay, so this is one of the key concepts that we're going to go with, and that kind of goes through a lot of the different lessons here. So let's look at the flow chart. So if we've experienced past trauma or attachment difficulties, so attachment meaning issues we had with our caregivers, with our parents, with significant people in our life, it then had an impact on us. And one of the things it impacted was our movement, our posture, our sensation, and our physiology itself. And so those body things changed to help us to adapt to those trauma and attachment problems that we had. And then it kind of stays with us, even when we're out of that original situation. So then it affects our current feelings about our body, and it might lead us to want to disconnect from our body because the sensations are associated with old stuff. And it even might, change our perception of pain. We might actually feel physical pain that's associated with the emotional pain of the past. So there's a lot of stuff that lingers now that may not be adaptive at this time, but it was adaptive at the original time. And our body has a hard time changing on its own because it was so adaptive and it wants to keep protecting us. But sometimes we have to make deliberate choices to continue to change it for the here and now to make it adaptive in our current lives. Okay, so if we look at the bottom part, this is kind of the goal of sensorimotor psychotherapy. So becoming aware of, through mindfulness, and changing our body responses, right? So once we're aware, then we can make some changes. It could help us move beyond our habits of the past and heal. Okay, so that's kind of one of the foundational concepts in sensorimotor psychotherapy. And this goes through the whole curriculum, basically. Okay, so then the next lesson was called The Language of the Body, Procedural Learning. So we introduced a vocabulary word. So the body things that we talked about in the center here are actually part of what they call procedural learning or procedural memory. So in that lesson, I went over the different types of memory. So some are what they call explicit memory. So it's memory that you could kind of deliberately call up, declarative memory, like remembering facts. emotional memory, or sorry, autobiographical memory, remembering facts about our life, emotional memory, reconnecting with old emotions because perhaps it's similar to current emotions. And the deepest one is procedural learning and memory. So those have to do with what's in the pictures here. So it has to do with motor actions. So for example, when you know how to ride a bike and people say, you never forget how to ride a bike, right? It's because it's an automatic action that you learn and you don't even have to think about after a while. So that's just a neutral example of procedural learning or memory. Or let's say tying your shoes. Your fingers just might automatically know what to do to tie a bow. That's procedural learning. Another part that's more relevant in sensorimotor psychotherapy is our survival responses, right? So our body learns how to go into fight, flight, freeze, fold, and reaching out for help modes in order to help us survive. And sometimes we end up favoring one of those over another because it was more helpful to us in the past. And so when we get reminded of old stuff, we automatically go into one of those survival modes, such as fight, flight, freeze, fold, okay? It's also related to what they call approach or avoidance behaviors. So because of our past experiences, we learn how to approach certain things that feel familiar and helpful and avoid certain things that seem, more dangerous and threatening. So we might automatically do that even if it doesn't make sense. So let's say I'm in contact with a really tall man and I automatically feel like I want to avoid him. But he didn't do anything to me now. It just reminds me on some level of maybe a man who's hurt me in the past. So I automatically feel like I need to move away. Or let's say I have a history of substance abuse and I was gravitating toward other substance abusers. I might automatically gravitate or approach people that feel familiar to me because they're like the people I used to use with, right? So we learn these patterns and automatically do these things. And it's actually kind of like a memory. We don't usually associate it with being a memory because we think memories are just like the verbal things that we recall. But it's like our body remembers and kind of just goes into these things, all right? So that's, again, very related to this center part here, okay? So it's a kind of a procedural memory that helped us to adapt to an old situation, but it continues now and it may or may not be adaptive now, okay? So as the green part says on the bottom, we can still change procedural memory. It lasts for a long time, but when we're more aware of it, we use our mindfulness to realize what these movements are and why they're occurring and what the triggers are. We could then describe what they are, put it into words, and practice different movements, right? So through my procedural learning and memory, I might have learned that it was safer to curl up and make myself small. And I might automatically do that when I feel a little uncomfortable. But if I realize that's my trend, for example, I could then do an opposite movement and maybe stand up taller, lift my chin, straighten my spine. Okay, and that could change the sequence. And it could create new procedural learning and memory that's more appropriate for the here and now. All right, so just a little example there. Okay, so the next lesson was called Pay Attention, the Orienting Response. So we automatically orient ourselves to novel stimuli in the environment or things that grab our attention. But what grabs each person's attention could be kind of an individual thing, okay? So based on our experiences, we develop habits of paying attention to certain things, okay? So if I was in battle and I heard a boom, like a loud noise, that meant danger for me. And I might have automatically ducked and run for cover because that meant a bomb, it meant something very dangerous. So now, if I hear firecrackers, I might automatically want to duck and cover because I'm oriented to that very loud noise. I associate it with danger and then I react, okay? Or maybe I automatically orient toward people that I think don't like me. Or I orient toward people that I think do like me. Or I might have certain habits of looking for certain things. Maybe if I'm a substance abuser, I might orient toward tinfoil because it reminds me of smoking heroin. You know, things that might be individual to me because of my past. But just like the automatic body movements, I can also be aware, become aware of my orienting habits and then choose to orient to other things that might help me now, right? So instead of always looking at the scowl on somebody's face or a sign of potential rejection or disapproval, maybe I'll try to orient to other people that seem like they do like me, or I'll orient myself to the times when that other person is smiling at me or gives me a kind eyes. So those might have been things I overlooked because I didn't trust them before, or just they didn't mean much to me before, but now I could choose to pay more attention to them. And that can kind of change my view of things. It could change my feelings. It could change the way I perceive my life. Okay, so this is an important concept as well. So when I focus on the outside, I don't always have to look at the same things. There's many things in the environment I can look at, and I could change what I'm looking at or attending to and so with my senses, and that could change my experience. Okay, all right. Next lesson was called Mindfulness of the Present Moment. So for all you mindfulness fans out there, so this one, mindfulness is part of a lot of different therapies. It's about being aware. It's about being in the present moment, using our senses, deliberately focusing our attention, making the choice as to where we're putting our attention, kind of like I just talked about here. Instead of automatically looking at something or attending to something, I might deliberately choose to put my attention somewhere else. Okay, so that's another aspect of mindfulness too. One of the key things that is introduced in this one is what they call the 5 building blocks of experience. So this is a concept in sensorimotor psychotherapy that's used many times in a variety of lessons. It's really useful. And so, there's some exercises with this here, but there's also exercises many other places. So what are the 5 building blocks? It's our 5 sense perceptions. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Our thinking or our beliefs, our emotional experience, our body movements or the movements we want to make, and our body sensations, okay? And at any moment, we could choose to tune into these things one by one and kind of fully become aware of the moment and our experience by tuning into these 5 building blocks. And by choosing to tune into one versus another or change our experience of a building block, we could change our whole experience and our patterns. So that's what the next one's all about. So this one's called directed mindfulness and neuroplasticity. So think of directed mindfulness as I'm directing my attention on purpose to certain building blocks that might change my experience of a whole situation. Neuroplasticity, as you can see here by the picture, it's about our brain and how our brain continues to change throughout our life. It's like molding plastic, okay? It's not like once you have a brain, you're adult, that's it, you can't change. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's actually not true. Our brains are continually changing and adapting as we expose ourselves to new things. And one of the ways we could change our brain is by using directed mindfulness. We're deliberately changing the experience of what we're paying attention to so that our brain starts to create new patterns. All right, really useful. So this also fits in with the building blocks. So here we're introducing the idea that we have different reactions and states and clusters of building blocks that we've developed over time. So for example, as I put here, we might have the afraid of abandonment cluster. So every time I'm afraid someone's going to reject or abandon me or leave me, I have a certain type of response in each building block that clusters together, okay? Or let's say I feel like somebody's dissing me. I might have a how dare you kind of reaction, right? Hey, what are you doing? And that's a cluster in itself, right? I might have another one where I'm afraid of elevators and my afraid of elevator cluster comes up, okay? So in order to change my response to those triggers, I have to really use my directed mindfulness skills with the 5 and change my experience of the 5 building blocks, okay? So how can I do this? So to break up the clusters, we can look at some of these techniques on the bottom. So we might notice that sometimes in an experience, we pay attention to our thoughts more than all the other building blocks. So let's say when I'm afraid of people abandoning me, I think, how will I ever live without this person? right? And I might have that plus other thoughts that flood my mind. And that's the most prominent experience for me. But instead of being lost in this experience, I'm going to now use directed mindfulness to pay attention to it. I'm going to step back from my thoughts and just observe my thoughts. And that in itself starts to change the cluster because it's a new approach to the building block. Okay. Another thing I can do is shift which building block I'm paying attention to the most. So instead of, let's say, just focusing on my thoughts or mostly focusing on my thoughts, let's say I say, all right, I'm going to try an experiment and I'm going to put my thoughts on the side for a minute and just tune into what my body's doing. So while I'm feeling fear of abandonment, I'm just going to tune into what my body's doing. And putting my attention in a new place changes my experience of the cluster and changes the cluster itself. Or I could even choose to pay attention to a different aspect of a different building block. So let's say instead of focusing on the body sensation that jumps out to me the most when I'm afraid of abandonment, it might be like my heart fluttering because I'm so anxious about it. Maybe I'm going to choose to focus on the feeling of my feet pressing into the ground. And that gives me a new sense of strength and it changes my experience of the cluster. All right, so that's the whole idea with this stuff. Okay. This one, I think this video scared some people off because I didn't get a lot of hits on this one yet. So the triune brain and information processing. Okay, so tri means three. So tri like tricycle. Okay, so our brains have three different sections. So one is called the reptilian brain. So this is like the dinosaur brain. This is what reptiles also have. And this has to do with more the sensory motor processing. So it has to do with the three building blocks relating to movement, body sensations, and five sense perceptions. Okay, so it's the same thing that reptiles also have. And it has to do with survival responses. It has to do with basic bodily functions such as respiration, heart rate, right? The mammalian brain, or the limbic brain, has to do with the limbic system and our emotions, right? So that relates to the emotional building block and our emotional experience. And then the neocortex, neo means new, it's the newest part of our brain, evolutionary wise, and that's our thinking brain. So that has to do with our cognitive processing and our thinking building block, okay? So when you experience trauma, these three different brains are impacted. And not only are they individually impacted, but they may not work as well together. A healthy brain, they kind of work, you know, in concert, and they're kind of, you know, balancing each other, and it flows and it creates a better experience for us. But it kind of gets off kilter when we have an experience of trauma or attachment problems in our history. So, for example, I might easily get triggered by things, and my subcortical brains, meaning my mammalian brain and reptilian brain, might get overly activated, right? So I'm triggered by something, I might get into survival mode, my emotions might get really intense, right? So that might be part of my experience. Or, you know, my neocortex goes offline. So it's hard to think because I'm so revved up and prepared for survival. Other times, as a defense, I might just stay up in my head a while, just to cut off my experience of my feelings, because the feelings and body sensations are associated with painful things. So I might just be a very intellectualized person. So I had that kind of imbalance. All right. So the idea, though, with sensorimotor psychotherapy is that we're going to try to observe what our three different brains do, get to know that function better, and to try to help them work back together again so that we have a better balance in ourselves. All right. One way to do that is what they call top-down processing. So using our thoughts in order to influence our emotions and our body sensations, right? So CBT does a lot of that, cognitive behavior therapy. Sensorimotor psychotherapy is more of a bottom-up approach. So that's changing our body or reptilian brain type things in order to change our emotions and our thinking. So we're going to introduce that much more in sensorimotor psychotherapy than maybe you've had in other more talk therapies, okay? All right, next, furthering our goal of getting more attuned with our body. This one's called exploring body sensations. Okay, so this touches on the fact that our body sensations are often associated with other things because of our histories, right? So a racing heart isn't just a racing heart. It's fear, it's I'm gonna die, it's I'm gonna be attacked, it's I'm in danger. So there's other associations with it. it clusters together with other building blocks, such as emotions and thoughts. And so therefore, it's hard for me to tune into certain body sensations because of the painful associations I have with them, right? And that kind of makes sense. So in order to neutralize our body sensations so we can work with them better, there's a technique we can use. So if you look at the bottom half, right, I kind of separated the building blocks. How do we separate them? By using different specific vocabularies for each one, and by looking at them one at a time. So instead of them clustering together with meaning, so my heart rate, fear, and I'm going to die clustering together, I'm just going to look at, for example, my heart rate, put a word to it, describing the sensation, and just staying with it mindfully, separating out the other stuff. And practicing to doing that neutralizes it more. So in this lesson, I provide a vocabulary of sensations, a separate vocabulary for emotions, just using emotional words, fear, anger, guilt, shame, jealousy, envy, things like that. And a vocabulary for thoughts, right? So common, deeply held beliefs, positive and negative, that we might have, okay? So, because sometimes we mix up the vocabulary, right? So separating it out really helps us clarify those building blocks, decrease the associations, and help to neutralize them so we can work with these things better. Okay, so next, two more big vocabulary words, neuroception and the window of tolerance. All right, so I'm going to define these for you here. So neuroception basically means how our brains, neuro, right, perception, safety or danger. Okay, so based on what's happening now and associating to my past experience, my brain's going to help me prepare to adapt and to survive. So it's going to scan my environment, internal and external, and figure out if this is safe, if this is dangerous, or if it's life-threatening, or perhaps neutral, okay? And so based on that assessment, it's then gonna lead to a different response, okay? However, sometimes our perception's off. Sometimes we perceive danger when there isn't danger, right? We might see a rope and think it's a snake, for example. We might see a person we think is dangerous, but it's really a nice person. But because we're associating it unconsciously with old stuff, we might over assume danger when there isn't any. And so therefore, we overreact and we get into survival mode more often than we need to, okay? And that decreases our enjoyment and ability to participate in life, okay? So let's look at the window of tolerance diagram here. So on the one hand, when we perceive danger, we might go into hyperarousal. So we might feel like really revved up, really anxious, really activated, mobilized, and preparing for protecting ourselves, fight, flight, okay? We also might go the other direction, hypoarousal. If we feel like our life is threatened and we can't fight and we can't run away, we might shut down and we might play dead almost. And that might have been an adaptive response for us, especially if we were a little kid and we couldn't run away from a dangerous parent, we couldn't fight back a dangerous parent. Our body might have memorized shutting down, and that was the easiest thing to do and the most safe thing to do. So if you have a history of trauma or attachment problems, you might much more be likely to get into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And your window of tolerance, which is the optimal level of arousal, might be very small. So there might be very few situations where you feel safe and comfortable. More often, you might feel in danger or threat mode. So one of the goals is to widen our window of tolerance, increase the amount of situations where we could truly accurately perceive safety and feel safe. And that allows us to participate in life better, to interact with others better, to explore the world more, and it increases our quality of life, okay? So we go over these different states, being able to recognize when we're in each one, and getting better at moving into the window of tolerance. Okay, then we talked about the 3 phases of therapy, okay? And the sensorimotor psychotherapy skills correspond with these 3 phases. So after this video, we're gonna be starting into the first of these 3 phases, okay? So the first phase, which is often, by the way, the 3 phases of therapy make the most sense when you're dealing with trauma, okay? So the first phase is called developing resources. So in this phase, we're building a foundation of coping skills. We're getting better at widening our window of tolerance, just coping with everyday life without getting hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused or engaging in target behaviors. So this whole section is going to teach us how to do this better. We're going to learn to identify our survival resources. What were the things that actually did help us get through these situations? And perhaps we could capitalize on them more. It helps us to recognize and further develop the strengths that we do have. We could, instead of just focusing on the bad stuff about ourselves or the failures we've had, what are the things that are our strengths, our talents, and our competencies? And how could we build them more into our life or even try new ones, expand them? How we develop, of course, somatic resources to regulate arousal. How can we better use our body to keep our arousal in the window of tolerance, right? There's several lessons and several techniques for that we're going to go over too. And revise our orienting habits, right? So again, so instead of, let's say, focusing on the most threatening thing in our environment, we're going to learn to look at other things too. And it broadens our perception of the world. And it makes it feel like the world's a better place sometimes. Okay, next phase. Once you built that foundation, once you widen your window of tolerance, you feel like you could cope with life better just on a day-to-day basis. Now you're going to be more ready to get into the painful stuff, right? You'll have more capacity to handle it without falling apart. So this techniques for addressing our memories of the past, not just the verbal memories, right? Our neocortex, declarative memories, autobiographical memories, but also how the memories impact our body, okay? And so we're going to change how the trauma is remembered and felt in ourselves by also changing how our body responds to it. Okay, and this is procedural memory. See how it's all linked together? It's important to have all these vocabularies, right? Okay, and then finally, moving forward. So now that we developed some more resources, we've dealt with some of the stuff from the past, resolved some of those things, we're more ready to move forward with our life. What are the things that I always wanted to do that I couldn't quite do because I was so bogged down by being in threat mode? Or I couldn't do because my emotions were too intense, or because I was so focused on old stuff, or I was so depressed that I couldn't do it. So now that I'm in a better place, how do I make my life better? How do I improve my quality of life? And as in DBT, say, make a life worth living, okay? So how could I use, so some of the ways to do this, using my body in enriching ways to improve my experience, rather than thinking the body is my enemy, right? Maybe it was my enemy in the past because of some other things, but I could change my relationship with my body and now use it in a good way. I can learn to regulate my emotions better so I could stay in that window of tolerance. And I could also improve my relationships, right? When I'm more regulated, it's easier for me to get along with other people and to not see people as threatening, and to create better boundaries, to know how to reach out, to bring people in, and how to, push people away a little bit when necessary. So this way increases my feeling of safety so I could stay in that window of tolerance in a relationship. Okay, so these are the summary of the basic concepts and skills. So if you haven't watched the videos of them yet, I hope it kind of whet your appetite to try it, because they're all really, really useful stuff. If not, I hope this kind of helped put it together for you again to kind of keep it fresh in your mind. So you're ready to move with me into the next phase, which is the developing resources set of skills. Okay, so thanks for listening, and I'll see you real soon. Okay, bye guys.